Legend of Blue Eyes White Dragon. Release date, March 8th, 2002. Set type, core set. Major strategies, the baseline. Impact, the start of a long journey. The Legend of Blue Eyes White Dragon would be the inaugural set and bring the Yu-Gi-Oh! TCG to the masses, being distributed in North America by Upper Deck Entertainment, separately from Konami, the company that owns and distributes Yu-Gi-Oh! In Japan. The basic structure of the game is to use monsters, magic cards, and trap cards to control a board and drop the opponent's life points to 0, winning the game when you did. And as such, this introduction to the game contained mostly vanillas and weak stat lines that are objectively worse than the best ones. Honestly, at this early stage of the game, it was a safe assumption that a monster's stats were the most important part of the card, which led to most decks' primary beater being Skull Redbird at 1550, the strongest attack without a tribute. If we look into monsters that require tributing over existing monsters on the field to summon, the level 5 and 6 1 tribute monsters would get you up to 2k with Curse of Dragon, and the level 7 and higher 2 tribute monsters would receive the highest value in the game of 3000, held by the titular Blue Eyes. As such, since it was extremely difficult to get above a 2k stat line in these early days, some of the most important cards would be those of the 2k defender walls. Aquamador, Mystical Elf, Giant Soldier of Stone, and Spirit of the Harp all held defense values of 2000, meaning that to attack over them it would require a minimum of a 2 tribute monster, locking in Stall as the name of the game. This was further pushed by the only real effect monsters in this pack being those of Maneater Bug and Hane, both of which can answer one monster on a flip effect, meaning triggering them when they are flipped face up, by either destroying it or bouncing it to hand respectively, being defensive options above all else. With Stall being such a popular option, life point dropping was not the only win condition that would be experimented with, as in this early stage there were 3 ways to win: dropping the opponent's life points to 0, which by far was the most common, via deck out by the opponent being unable to draw when they were required, and by far the most memorable, assembling the 5 pieces of Exodia. Exodia, if you have it in hand along with the other pieces, wins you the game instantly, meaning that assembling the pieces was a rather popular option out the gate with the defensive prowess of the 2k walls, as well as its popularity in the anime. Thankfully, monsters weren't the only way through, and with that, LOB did bring a number of various magic cards to the game, options to back up your monsters with to provide powerful buffs, debuffs, and general utility to the game state. Some were simple, like the field magics and equip magics that modulated attack and defense values in a minor way, usually capping out at 300 per effect, with field magics modulating the whole board, only allowing one to be up at a time for both players, and equip magics modulating a single monster, staying on the field while that monster is. Some were a lot more complicated, like polymerization, which allowed you to take 2 specific monsters from hand or field and fuse them together to make a new fusion monster kept in the fusion deck. But only one of these even had a respectable enough stat line to even consider, and on top of that, its materials, while including the best 1 tribute monster, didn't do much in terms of a 2k wall meta, meaning that you'd only be really playing them in case you drew all 3 at once, which wasn't the most reliable strategy, especially when it could be removed by any number of the removal magic cards at this stage, including Fissure, which pops the lowest attack monster the opponent controls, Dark Hole, which wipes the board of all monsters, and Raigeki, which just wipes the opponent's monsters. Because of the over-reliance on walls at this initial stage, these 3 cards were some of the most powerful cards you could be playing, alongside the utility magic cards of Monster Reborn, which let you bring back any monster from either graveyard, and Pot of Greed, which
this card allows me to draw 2 new cards.
There was also Swords of Revealing Light, which effectively stalled out the game for 3 turns by blocking the opponent's attack, once again useful for stall strategies. There were also trap cards, which operate like magic cards except they can be activated whenever you want as long as they have been face down for a turn. However, this initial set only gave us 3. Dragon Capture Jar was by far and away the worst of the 3, being a continuous trap, meaning it stays on the field after you activate it, swapping all dragons to defense while face up. This really only ever countered specifically Blue Eyes White Dragon, and as such never really saw use since any of the removal magics could take care of him just fine on their own. Two-pronged attack was a bit more useful, able to destroy any opponent's monster by destroying 2 of your own, being a versatile removal option that can be used on your opponent's turn, but also came with the heavy cost of removing your own board presence. distance, making its utility limited overall. The one trap that would be unanimously determined as actually worthwhile was Trap Hole, able to destroy anything that is normal summoned or flip summoned with 1,000 attack or more. Seeing as how special summons effectively only happened via polymerization or Monster Reborn, this meant that 90% of the time you could stop an opponent's power push right as it's getting started, being another option loaded into the arsenal of the removal tools in this initial landscape. Overall, this was a bit of a bleak looking game right out the gate, as anyone who's played even a single game of LOB format can attest, but thankfully this initial stage only lasted a couple of weeks, as a few other releases would help spark a more common interest in the game as a whole over the remainder of the month. The first would be the localization of 2 video games for the franchise, being Dark Duel Stories for the Game Boy Color and Forbidden Memories for the PlayStation. Both of these games do not follow the actual rules of the TCG, utilizing their own unique sets of rules that make them quite interesting games to play through, which I've actually covered before on this channel, but they also each came with 3 promo cards for the newly released TCG to help spark an interest, with Forbidden Memories coming with Red Eye's Black Metal Dragon, Harpy's Pet Dragon, and Metal Morph, and Dark Duel Stories having promo versions of Blue Eyes, Dark Magician, and Exodia. While none of these were relevant, Forbidden Memories promos specifically would set the precedent that new releases could come from these promos exclusively, with this being the only way for obtaining these cards until 2007 for Black Metal and Metal Morph, and until 2009 for Harpy's Pet Dragon, marking themselves in the coming years as collector's pieces, with the Dark Duel Stories promos specifically being some of the most sought after cards from these early months to this day. The other release, and by far the more impactful to the game as a whole, was the release of the Yugi and Kaiba starter decks, which not only made the game far more accessible for kids in 2002, but also included the official instructions on how to play the game, something the initial booster packs had no way of conveying. You would think that these starters would be just collections of cards from the initial set, packaged as a basic deck to get players started out, but you'd be mistaken, as these decks not only contained entirely new cards, but also a slew of cards that blew the meta of LOB wide open. For starters, there were a number of new no tribute monsters that all put Skull Redbird to shame, including Great White, Rogue Doll, Ryukishin Powered and Man-Eating Treasure Chest at 1600, Neo the Magic Swordsman and Battlelocks at 1700, and the end-all be-all of all beaters in these early days, Lajin the Mystical Genie of the Lamp at 1800. These would completely warp the beatdown meta around themselves, being a slew of monsters with respectable stat lines, but that wasn't the best part. Summon Skull would also be released here, a 1 tribute 2500 attack monster, now being the most powerful 1 tribute that could actually attack over the 2k walls that plagued the game up to this point. The sudden rise of Summon Skull would also make Trap Hole infinitely more important, as it was one of the only ways to prevent a massive advantage swing to your opponent off of summoning a single monster. Walls also got a significant buff too with Wall of Illusion, which sacrifices 150 defense from the 2k baseline in order to bounce anything that attacks it back to hand. This trade-off was a no-brainer at this stage, as even with the new attackers in the pool, 1850 was still high enough to block any no tribute attacker, and attacking over it with a 1 tribute attack would put that threat back in the hand, rendering any board presence it made moot. There was also now Trap Master, who on flip could pop a set trap card, which in turn made it quite useful for setting as a bluff, with many assuming it was a wall of some kind, then flipping it the next turn to potentially remove a problem trap before developing your attacker. There were also new traps here to buff out the super type, being those of Wabaku, able to block all damage and battle destruction for a turn, Reinforcements, able to buff a monster's attack by 500 for a turn, and Ultimate Offering, which gives you an extra summons during your main phase or the opponent's battle phase at the cost of 500 life points per summon. These all found immediate use, with Reinforcements giving Beatdown away over the walls, Wabaku letting Stall keep their walls up or letting Beatdown take crash trades, and Ultimate Offering being one of the most reliable ways to swarm a board at this stage. As for new magic cards, Change of Heart would be another addition to this power magic lineup, able to steal an opponent's monster for a turn, marking itself as a massive advantage swinger, especially if you're able to steal a monster to then tribute over for your own summoned Skull. Card Destruction also helped fill the necessary void, making both players discard their hands to draw the same number of cards, being a counter card for specifically the instant win condition of Exodia, but also for being a massive draw tool. Lastly would be the surfacing of the first true game plan deck, being that of Dragon Turbo. Lord of D blocks targeting dragon monsters with card effects, but much more importantly, while on the field, enables the magic card the Flute of Summoning Dragon, which special summons 2 dragons from the hand. This combo could realistically summon out 2 tribute dragons with ease, meaning accessing multiple copies of Blue Eyes White Dragon at once was now theoretically possible, though not super reliable as it did require a bunch of factors to roll in your favor. Still, it would be a disservice to not mention it. This would be the metagame for the next month, being a tug of war between beatdown and stall decks, with the numerous power magics effectively determining which way the game would go constantly. As such, Upper Deck would implement a Forbidden and Limited list to the TCG on May 7th of 2002, which notably did contain a Forbidden section already, though did not place any cards into it. As for limitations, newly limited, meaning only 1 copy of each is allowed in your deck, were the 5 pieces of Exodia, Change of Heart, Dark Hole, Monster Reborn, Pot of Greed, and Raigeki, and newly semi-limited, meaning up to 2 copies each are allowed per deck, were Card Destruction and Swords of Revealing Light. This was a bit of cleanup to the massive power magic card nature of the meta at large, limiting the Exodia pieces to prevent issues with draw magics causing an FTK, or first turn kill, as well as what had become known in the metagame as the Power 5 magic cards. Each of these cards was known to be able to completely swing the course of a game on their own, with Change of Heart stealing a monster to push massive advantage swings, Dark Hole and Raigeki's board wipes being known by all, Monster Reborn's Revival being uncounterable at the time, and Pot of Greed getting you to copies of the other 4 more reliably. With this limitation, the first true historic format of the game was forged, being referred to as Yugioh format, named for the starter decks of the era, and it is commonly referenced as the first true format of the game's history, which saw basically named strategies like Baitdown and Stall becoming common faces, with a couple of game plan decks like Dragon Turbo in the fringes. This balance update would also set a precedent, being that roughly a month to 2 months after each core set release, an update to the Forbidden and Limited list would be released to help balance out any power outliers from the previous set and keep the meta as a whole healthier, adjusting where needed. This metagame would be fairly solved for just under the next 2 months, only shaken up by the release of the next core set to the game, which, considering it was about to double the available card pool, was bound to change something. Metal Raiders. Release date, June 26, 2002. Set type, core set. Major strategies, new effects to spice up the game. Impact, the rise of the critter. Metal Raiders was the second set released for the TCG, and rather than taking the same direction as LOB by introducing a bunch of stat stakes with not much else, Raiders took a completely different approach by introducing a variety of monsters with effects to cover a variety of use cases. Notably, almost all of the effect monsters in this set come in either pairs or sets of 6, with each set having similar effects to one another for different scenarios. Magician of Faith and Mask of Darkness are new flip monsters, recovering back a resource from grave on flip, with Faith grabbing back a magic and Mask grabbing back a trap. These would be experimented with almost immediately, with Mask able to recover key traps like Trap Hole and a few cards released in this set, and Faith able to recover any of the Power 5. As such, with the Power 5 being limited now and being completely game warping, Magician of Faith would move from this initial experimentation to being a staple piece of the meta as a whole, being a recycler that takes a turn to fire, which in this slow-paced metagame was perfectly acceptable for a drawback. Mystic Lamp, Legul, Oguchi, Genzo No. 7, Rainbow Flower, and Queen's Double all share the same effect to be able to attack the opponent's life points directly, being effectively chip shots that didn't do much overall, but did establish the effect for cards in the future. Hoshinigin, Starboy, Milus Radiant, Little Chimera, Bladefly, and Witch's Apprentice all share the effect to boost their respective attributes attack by 500 and decrease their designated rival attribute by 400 attack, with the rival pairings being Light and Dark, Water and Fire, and Earth and Wind. Once again, these weren't too meta impactful for the time being, but would be important in establishing a baseline for attribute support as a whole, which would get expanded upon in the next core set. White Magical Hat and Mass Sorcerer make advantage pushes upon dealing battle damage, with Hat discarding a card from the opponent's hand and Mass Sorcerer drawing a card. While neither of these would be particularly popular in historic play, retro play has discovered that Mass Sorcerer was actually a lot more useful than people initially expected, as by taking advantage on the board followed by its summon, you could standardly push far more advantage than the opponent was ready for power by threatening draws. On top of that, its 1400 defense was able to stop most of the effect monsters that we're going to be discussing here, meaning that you would need to use one of the normal monsters that's a stat stick, or some kind of a removal spell to get over it. And because you're attacking it face down, there's no way you're going to know that going into it. Sangan and Witch of the Black Forest, each upon being sent to grave, searches a monster from deck, with Sangan searching one with 1500 or less attack, and Witch searching for one with 1500 or less defense. These two were, without hyperbole, the best monsters in the set. Sangan and Witch could effectively search most monsters in the game at this stage, with them also being able to search each other if the desired monster was not in their individual search pool, being in the other. As such, beatdown focused decks heavily preferred Witch, able to grab key pieces like Lejin and Summon Skull, while stall focused decks preferred Sangan, able to grab any of the 2k walls or Wall of Illusion. These two would be a staple piece of every deck for the time being though, seeing play at their maximum allowed copies for a while after release. Crass and Dream Clown have board controlling effects tied to the changing of the battle position of the clown, with Crass bouncing a monster when swapping from defense to attack, and Dream popping a monster when swapping from attack to defense. These would be experimented with in an early days deck called Clown Control, aimed at utilizing the limited number of battle position changing cards to quickly swap the clowns between positions. But this would be mostly ineffective due to the lack of viable position swapping tools. Jirai Gumo and Dark Elf would take the mantle of the strongest no tribute summons at 2200 and 2000 attack respectively, but both coming with drawbacks to use that power, with Jirai taking a coin flip to see if you lose half of your life points when you attack, and Dark Elf taking a static 1000 payment to attack. While Jirai's cost was a bit too high to see real usage, Dark Elf on the other hand would see some considerable play, being effectively another 2k wall that could use that stat to attack with, as long as you're willing to pay the 1000 cost. Moving away from the pairs, there were also plenty of powerful standalone cards. 7-colored Fish would join Lejin at 1800 attack, being the most powerful no tribute summon that didn't come with any form of a drawback. Tribute to the Doomed provided targeted removal for monsters at a cost of a discard, being more directable than Fissure for a heavier cost. Thunder Dragon can discard itself to search for up to 2 additional copies from deck, being one of the most powerful deck thinning options at this stage, but also enabling Twin-Headed Thunder Dragon, being a powerful fusion that was actually decently easy to access thanks to one material being able to turn itself into 2. Cannon Soldier was able to tribute any other monster to burn the opponent for 500 any number of times a turn, which could be utilized with a combination of Sangan, Witch of the Black Forest, and Ultimate Offering to burn the opponent for 3k or more, but took an equal amount of life to pull off, so could only close a game from ahead. Muka Muka, while starting at a lower attack value of 600, gains 300 attack for every card in your hand, which going into the opponent's turn after discarding for hand size meant it could be sitting at 2400 with a full hand of 6, making it the most powerful no tribute attack value at this stage, but with heavy asterisks around that value. Heavy Storm serves as a counterpart to Dark Hole, able to wipe all magic and traps off the board in an instant, which both led to less bluff setting as a whole, but also a whole new level of bluff setting by setting Heavy Storm, making your opponent think that you didn't have it to set the fort, and then flipping it to wipe their board of options. Speaking of those options, Mirror Force was a new trap that, on the opponent's attack declaration, destroyed all of their attack position monsters. This was by far and away one of the most powerful options in the set, being effectively a pseudo Raigeki that could be used on the opponent's turn, moving it to see play in everything. Lastly would be the introduction of a new card type in counter traps, being unique as these were the only cards considered what is to be referred to as spell speed 3, meaning that once you chain a counter trap, the only thing that can be chained to it is another counter trap. All of these counter traps had a negation effect for a cost, with Magic Jammer negating magics with a discard, 7 Tools of the Bandit negating a trap for 1000 life points, Horn of Heaven negating a summon with a monster tribute, and Solemn Judgment doing all 3 for half of your life points. Out of these options, 7 Tools and Horn of Heaven were considerably weaker than the other 2. Solemn Judgment was unquestionably the best of these cards, but with the cost of half of your life points and the community at large not making the connection that the only important life point is the last one at this stage, it wouldn't see immediate widespread usage, but would be referred to as one of the strongest traps of the set. Magic Jammer though would see considerable play as Magic cards were unquestionably the most powerful cards in the game at this stage, and negating any of the power 5 with a Magic Jammer could spell fatal for the match as a whole. Similarly to LOB, a limited list would go into effect a week later to balance out the set, moving Mirror Force to limited and Sangan, Witch, and Heavy Storm to semi-limited. These changes came down so quickly because of the OCG, being the Japanese version of the game, which had these changes in place before the TCG set even released, released, allowing for, in most cases, the TCG to adopt the OCG changes rather quickly after a set's release. Now with Metal Raiders' release, though 7-colored fish got added to match Legend's 1800 attack value, they were still both considered the cornerstone of the meta, being 1800 attack as the strongest no drawback value you could have without getting into tribute summons, and thankfully both of these were easy to come by, with Legend being in a starter deck and fish being a common in Metal Raiders. Add to that the price of the game as a whole being decent, as the more expensive options were a bit few and far between, with really the only standouts at this stage being those of Raigeki, Mirror Force, and Heavy Storm, with most if not all of the other power cards being available at lower rarity printed in either their respective sets or in a starter deck. That was about to change with the release of the first Tournament Pack. Tournament Pack First Season, or TP1 for short, was a promotional pack given for entry for the first season of sanctioned events at the local level. These were some of the roughest packs in the history of the game to open, as the pull rates for specific cards were abysmal. This set came with 15 commons, 10 rares, 4 super rares, and 1 ultra rare in the set list, and not even a rare was guaranteed out of these packs, with the rare pull rates being roughly 1 in every 3 packs. Supers were even lower at 1 in 18, and ultras were the worst, seeing only 1 in every 108 packs. What made matters worse on this is that you couldn't buy these packs, as you could only ever get them from entering sanctioned events at the time, and would only receive one by doing so, which made hunting for a full set a chore and a half, and that was made worse by what the high end of the set actually was. All of these cards were random OCG imports, 97% of which were just not useful in the meta at all, such as Patrol Robo, who could look at a face down card, just one face down card, as much as you'd like, or Axe Raider, whose attack value was already less than that of Legion and Fish before it, and those were the super rares. However, the ultra rare slot here was occupied by Mechanical Chaser, an 1850 attack monster, now being the highest attack no drawback option, and that was a massive deal. To say that Mechanical Chaser changed the dynamic of the meta instantly on release is an understatement. 1850 is more than 1800, and as such, Mechanical Chaser would instantly be a staple to any deck for players that could afford its $200 price tag, being so high due to the abysmally small pull rate of TP1. And mind you, that's $200 in 2002. This was a massive departure from the solidly affordable pieces up until this point. Mechanical Chaser being exclusive to the tournament pack, in addition to being a roughly 1 in 108 packs pull rate, which equates to roughly 1 in every 5.5 boxes of the 20 pack set, and the only way to get them was to participate in an official tournament, where you would only get 1 pack, marking the beginning of a massive price disparity between players across the game's reach. There would be another core set release in the same month too, and that price disparity was about to get a bit worse, as the Power 5 were about to get a run for their money for the title of the best magics in the game. Spell Ruler. Release date September 16th, 2002. Set type Core Set. Major strategies: Tune, Equip Spells, Rituals. Impact: New power spell in town. I was gonna save this topic until we got to its time relevant point, but I think now is probably the best point to discuss it due to the repercussions it had on this set in particular. Magic Ruler was the third set in the TCG, but if you've bought any of the reprintings of the set since the initial waves in the early aughts, you probably know it by the name Spell Ruler. In 2003, over a year after the game's initial release, Upper Deck made the decision to rebrand all of the Magic cards that we've seen over the game thus far into Spell cards, and by extension rename this set to Spell Ruler specifically to avoid copyright issues with Wizards of the Coast and their game Magic the Gathering, and because of this, we'll now be referring to all Magic cards as spell cards from here on out. Spell Ruler, being the third set, followed a bit of a theme established with Metal Raiders, where Metal Raiders arguably overhauled the monster super type, giving effect monsters with interesting interactions to the game as a whole compared to LOB. Spell Ruler, as the name implies, gives an overhaul to spells, namely in a full establishment of the spell subcategories. At this stage, we already had normal, field, and equip spells, but with Spell Ruler we would receive the other 3 subcategories of quick play, ritual, and continuous, in addition to an overhaul of the previous categories. So let's take this one at a time. Equip spells saw a departure from the exclusivity of their previous incarnation to not only being extremely generic, but also providing far more significant effects and provide an additional effect when sent from field to grave, generally to recycle it. Some of these were minor, such as Horn of Light's 800 defense boost and 500 life to recycle to the top of deck optionally, Black Pendant's 500 attack boost and 500 burn when sent to grave, Malevolent Nuzzler's 700 attack boost and 500 life to recycle to top of deck optionally, or Horn of the Unicorn's 700 attack and defense boost with a required recycle to top of deck. But there were 2 in particular that were extremely powerful. Axe of Despair boosted its equip by 1000 attack, being the largest modifier in the game currently, and could recycle by tributing a monster when sent to grave, though generally never would use that effect due to the heavy cost, seeing play namely for the attack boost. The other being Megamorph, which doubles the attack of its equip if your life points are lower than the opponent's, or halves it if your life points are higher, being an extremely powerful tool for either making a massive comeback push or pushing advantage while you are ahead by equipping it to an opponent's monster. All of this was helped by the monster Mahavilo, who gains an additional 500 attack for every equip spell on them, meaning that prior to any boost a single equip provided, they would already be sitting at 2050, a significant number able to swing over almost any no tribute monster in the game, even the 2k walls, leading to an equip aggro deck being an extremely popular option in the new meta. There was also another equip spell meant to be used exclusively on the opponent's monsters, being Snatch Steal, effectively a change of heart as long as it's equipped, giving the opponent 1000 life for each of their turns you control it. This would be the first of 5 spells seen as the power spells of the set, being effectively additional copies of Change of Heart for most decks in the game, as the drawback wasn't nearly significant enough to discourage playing. Field spells would probably get the least significant boost to the existing types, being 6 field spells tied to monster attributes, being Gaia Power for Earth, Umeruka for water, Molten Destruction for fire, Rising Air Current for wind, Luminous Spark for light, and Mystic Plasma Zone for dark, with each boosting their attributes attack by 500 and dropping its attributes defense by 400. In the same vein of attribute support, each would also get what would become colloquially referred to as the element recruiters, being monsters that, when destroyed in battle, summon another monster of their attribute with 1500 or less attack from deck. These were Giant Rat for earth, Mother Grizzly for water, UFO Turtle for fire, Flying Kamakiri No. 1 for wind, Shining Angel for light, and Mystic Tomato for dark. Of these, the only one that would make an instant impact was Mystic Tomato, namely in that it could summon either Sangan or Witch of the Black Forest, giving you access then to that stat pool for the entire deck, which is extra impactful because of Sangan and Witch's semi-limits. Moving into the new subcategories, quick play spells operate as a pseudo-hybrid between spells and traps. During your turn, you can activate them from hand whenever they'd be appropriate at the same spell speed as a trap, meaning that you can fire them in battle or in phase while they're in your hand, or if you set them, they effectively become trap cards, being prevented from activating for the rest of the turn, but being usable on either player's turn at the same spell speed as a trap. For this set though, there was only 2 quick play spells that would be relevant, being Mystical Space Typhoon, a targeted spell trap removal piece, and Rush Recklessly, which power crept reinforcements by not only giving more attack at 700, but also being usable from hand on your own turn without setting it. These would both be important pieces for the developing metagame, with MST becoming almost a staple piece for years to come after this release, being the de facto spell trap removal piece for the next few eras. Ritual spells were tied to the new monster category of rituals, which operated in a similar vein to fusions. While fusions took a specific spell and 2+ specific monsters in hand for a boss that was always available, rituals take a specific boss card and a specific spell in hand, with the materials to make it being generic, taking tributes whose total levels are equal or greater than the monster being ritual summoned. There were a few rituals released here, most of which were unimpactful pack filler at best, but there was one true exception to this. Relinquished was a level 1 ritual, meaning it could be summoned the easiest out of all of them using only one monster as a tribute, and could steal an opponent's monster to be an equip onto himself, gaining that monster's attack and defense as well as battle protection by popping the equip instead. While not meta defining by any means, this was experimented with quite frequently, especially thanks to cards like Senju of the Thousand Hands and Sonic Bird, which could grab one of the 2 required cards each and could double as the tribute if necessary. The last of these new subcategories of spell would be Continuous, operating in the exact same vein as Continuous Traps, staying on the field after activation. Most of these new continuous spells fall into the category of what I refer to as the taxes cards, being continuous spells that require both players to pay a cost in order to take an action, such as Toll requiring a 500 life point payment to attack, Chain Energy requiring a 500 life point payment to play any card out of the hand, and Gravekeeper Servant requiring the opponent to mill a card to attack. In a similar vein, Messenger of Peace blocked either player from attacking with monsters with 1500 or more attack, but had an upkeep cost, requiring the controller to pay 100 life points in each of their standby phases or lose the card, which was an insultingly low cost if we're being fair. Lastly, Toon World simply requires a 1000 life point payment to activate with no other effects. This might seem useless, but in fact was meant as a way to enable the new subtype of monsters known as Toons, which at this point in time must first special summon themselves from hand if you control Toon World at the same tribute cost as if you were normal summoning them. Can't attack the turn they hit the board, must pay 500 to attack, can attack directly, and are destroyed if Toon World is not on the field. This initial batch included Blue Eyes Toon Dragon, Manga Rioran, Toon Mermaid, and Toon Summon Skull, all being monsters used by Pegasus in the original anime. Toon as a strategy had a lot of ifs behind it. They were good if you saw Toon World, and if you could set up on the big attackers fast, and if your monsters survived the turn, and if the opponent had no removal for your Toon World in the same set that MST gets released. There were just too many ifs to get around the idea that any number of cards removed these from the board, and the investment of both time and life points just wasn't worth it at this stage. Moving away from the spell super types, there were also a number of new regular spells added here that would push the needle that much further. Confiscation, Delinquent Duo, and the Forceful Sentry were all spells that hand ripped the opponent in slightly different ways, with Confiscation taking 1,000 life point payment to look at the opponent's hand and discard one, Delinquent Duo taking 1,000 to discard one at random and have the opponent discard another of their choice, and Forceful Sentry for no cost looking at the opponent's hand to send one card in it back to the deck. All three of these were invaluably powerful, with Confiscation and Forceful having the additional benefit of hand knowledge and the choice of what card to rip, while Delinquent trades that to take 2 cards instead. In the short period of these cards released until the balancing ban list that follows these sets, the format would be completely terrorized by hand rip aggro decks, maxing out on 3 copies of each of these, causing a truly unfun playing experience. Upstart Goblin, by giving the opponent 1,000 life, draws a card, being effectively a free deck thinning piece that replaces itself, though wasn't popular at this stage due to players placing a lot heavier emphasis on life totals. Giant Trunade effectively operates as a one-turn reprieve from back row, bouncing all spell traps back to their owner's hand. For now, this was effectively Heavy Storm light, but would see far more interesting applications as time moves forward. Painful Choice lets you choose 5 cards from the deck, has the opponent pick 1 to add to your hand, and sends the others to grave. This is a bit of a Sophie's Choice in many respects, allowing you to show your opponent the 5 best cards left in your deck and give you 1. But given the power level of the format, it wasn't too overbearing at this stage, though clearly would get a lot better with time. Giant Germ and Nimble Momonga are 2 additional floaters that operate uniquely compared to the attribute ones, floating into 2 additional copies of themselves, with Germ burning for 500 and Momonga healing for 1,000 when destroyed in battle. These would see some more minor experimentation, though the preference at the time was placed onto Momonga due to the heavier life point swing, but they didn't last for too long past the initial testing period. Lastly, Cyberjar, on flip, nukes all monsters on the field, has both players draw 5 and reveal them, and summons all level 4 or lowers among those cards in either attack or face down defense. This was a massive blowout card, effectively resetting the board and potentially causing a massive swing of board advantage if not handled correctly, which made this an almost instant staple for various decks, especially going into a hand rip heavy metagame. Thankfully, that completely unrestricted Wild West of hand rips would only last about 2 weeks, as the ban list was updated just 2 weeks later on October 1st, placing limits on Cyberjar, Confiscation, Delinquent Duo, Painful Choice, Snatch Steal, the Forceful Sentry, and Upstart Goblin, all of which were identified as the big advantage pushers of the set, but at 1 each, they would still be an active part of the metagame as a whole. They also wouldn't be the only hand rippers joining, as on the same day, distribution for Tournament Pack 2 would begin, sporting the new extremely expensive and difficult to find card in Morphing Jar, who on flip discards both players' hands and has both draw 5. This would pose a shift in the player mindset, as previously players adapted to not set their back row too heavily to play around Heavy Storm. Now, players would look at setting their entire hand to play around Morphing Jar, creating a unique mind game to what option the opponent might be sporting at any time cards get set. While this option was not as clearly meta warping as Mechanical Chaser before it, it was still a uniquely powerful effect that would affect the metagame at large, even if it wasn't a staple in majority of decks. Another new change would come just 3 days later in the first ever collectible 10s, offering reprints of some of the more iconic cards from these initial packs alongside boosters for the first 3 sets, with the 10 covers of Dark Magician, Blue Eyes, Red Eyes, Summon Skull, Lord of D, and Black Skull Dragon. On top of that, the Eternal Duelist Soul would release for the Game Boy Advance 2 weeks later, bringing another set of unique promos in Exchange, Graceful Dice, and Skull Dice. Though none of these would be particularly meta impactful, but did continue the trend of providing unique cards as video game tie-in promos. This would also be the precursor to the 4th set for the TCG, which with Metal Raiders overhauling monsters and Spell Rulers overhauling spells, I'm sure you can guess where this set is going. Pharaoh's Servant. Release date, October 20th, 2002. Set type, Core Set. Major strategies, trap counterparts to spells, counters to various gameplay elements. Impact, the early signs of power creep. Pharaoh's Servant was the 4th set for the TCG, and quite notably came out only a month after Spell Ruler, being so far the fastest turnaround time for a core set in the TCG, with the standard up until this point being a 3-month gap, supposedly being so that there could be 4 core sets in a year, giving the set a beat before the holiday shopping season started, and to help catch up to the OCG set release schedule, which releases on average 4 sets a year. But notably, the TCG sets at this point are combining together 2 OCG sets at a time, which at 4 TCG sets a year would be equivalent to 8 OCG sets. Pharaoh's Servant on paper seemed to be trying to overhaul traps in the same vein as the previous 2 sets overhauled monsters and spells, but in reality only a few of these traps would be impactful in the slightest, though the ones that broke through would truly shine as power players for the game as a whole. Call of the Haunted effectively read as Monster Reborn on a trap, with the additional downside of tying the monster to the trap where if it gets destroyed the monster dies too. This was arguably worse than Monster Reborn, only hitting your own grave and having the destruction drawback, but was also chainable to cards or flippable in response to attacks, making it have many applications that Reborn simply didn't. One such application was in the case of MST, as you could chain it to an MST targeting it while it's set to revive a Sanganer Witch, having the MST pop it right after and getting a search off since the monster was destroyed in the process. In the same vein as Call, Premature Burial is an equipped spell that can revive a monster for 800 life points, also tying the monster to the destruction of the spell. While in many respects this was a direct downgrade to Reborn, an interesting quirk of the spell was that it specified that the monster was only destroyed if Premat was also destroyed, meaning that if it was removed from the field without destruction, the monster would remain, leading to an option of utilizing Giant Trunade from the last set to not only clear back row temporarily, but also to reuse Premature without losing the initial monster. Imperial Order would be the other standout card, negating all spells while active at the cost of a 700 life point payment in your standby phase. Quite notably for the time, this was an optional upkeep cost, meaning that you could flip it on the opponent's turn, negating their spells for the whole turn, then not pay it coming into your turn to destroy it and use your own power spell, being an instant staple with the insane amount of power it held. Almost out of necessity, since Imperial Order would negate its primary counter in MST, Dust Tornado would also be printed here, being a trap card MST that also had the option to set another spell trap from hand on resolution, being niche, but giving the card some applications that MST just doesn't. Time Seal skips the opponent's next draw phase, effectively making them miss a draw as a slow hand rip of sorts. This wouldn't be particularly useful yet, being effectively a 1 to 3 turn delay on getting its effect, but as more hand rip options become available, this would find a home. Backup Soldier, if you have 5 or more monsters in grave, returns 3 1500 or less attack normals from grave to hand, being next to useless for a majority of decks, but for Exodia specifically allows them the painful choice away 3 pieces and recover them with a 2-card combo. Ceasefire flips all monsters face up and burns the opponent for 500 for each effect monster on the field, notably blocking all flip effects when doing so. This would be seen as a way to counter out the various flip effects like Magician of Faith, Cyberjar, and Morphing Jar that had gotten popular as options for the metagame, but not nearly as usefully as Nobleman of Crossout, which banishes a set monster, then if it was a flip, banishes all copies of that monster from both players' decks. Knock would quickly become a staple of the metagame, not only for countering out flips, but for removing defensive options before they become a thorn. Moving past the spells and traps, Jinzo is a 1 tribute 2400 attack monster that, as long as he's on the field, negates all traps. While tribute summonable monsters have been mostly unimpactful since Summon Skull, Jinzo trades 100 attack points to completely remove threats like Trap Hole and Mirror Force from the equation, marking himself as a solid addition to many various strategies. Morphing Jar number 2, on flip, shuffles all monsters on the field back into the deck, has players reveal cards off the top until they reveal the same number of monsters they shuffled back, summons all level 4 or lower ones face down in defense, and sends all other cards to the grave. A similar effect to Cyberjar in many respects, Morphing Jar number 2 would see play in a similar vein, though not nearly as widespread as the aforementioned Jar. Cold Wave stuns the usage of all spells and traps for a turn, usable only as the first action of your main phase 1. At this point in time, this would see next to no play, as both Heavy Storm and Giant Trunade did its job better, but as time moves on, this will become far more powerful as the expectation of what monsters alone can do will be raised significantly. Limiter removal doubles the attack of all of your machines for the turn, but then destroys them all at the end of the turn. This would be a major draw to play machine-centric strategies, though powerful enough machines to fill the niche were few and far between, with the only currently viable piece to fill that void being Mechanical Chaser, so that would be considered niche for now. Thousand Eyes Restrict Perfect is a fusion of Relinquished and Thousand Eyes Idol that shares the same effect as Relinquished that also prevents attacking and battle position swapping. By far and away the most powerful fusion we've seen yet, though still wasn't good enough to see play through the glaring downsides of playing fusions in the first place, but would be relevant later in the era. Goblin Attack Force has a record-breaking 2300 attack on a no tribute summon, but has the nasty downside of swapping to defense if it attacks for 2 turns, making it a massive double-edged sword in a way, but still a powerful option for beatdown strategies. The Fiend Mega Cyber, if the opponent has 2 or more monsters than you, can be special summoned from hand. This would be the first of its kind come from behind catch-up tool, but the issue stood that if the opponent had massed that much advantage over you on board, there were plenty of other tools available to even that out, like Mirror Force, Raigeki, and Dark Hole, that would all be more useful outside of that specific situation. Lastly, Gearfried the Iron Knight matched its attack stat to Lajin and 7 colored, but had the drawback of not being able to be used with equip spells. While that sounds like a pain, the biggest draw to this was actually that Gearfried couldn't be taken with Snatch Steal, which in a weird way made him actually a safer option to play over the previous 2 1800s. The balancing for this particular set would come a little over a month later, notably making more than just changes reflecting this set, but also adjustments to cards from previous sets. Newly limited were Jinzo, Morphing Jar, Witch of the Black Forest, Card Destruction, Limiter Removal, Premature Burial, Swords of Revealing Light, Call of the Haunted, Ceasefire, and Imperial Order. Newly semi-limited were Morphing Jar number 2, Nobleman of Crossout, and Backup Soldier. While a good number of the cards from the set were expected to be meta breakers, in reality only a small handful were, and that was going to become a trend for a bit in the TCG, having sets that bring in these massive counts of cards only to have maybe 4 or 5 be relevant, perpetuating the issue of the TCG at this stage that it was effectively good card turbo. This would lead us out of 2002 Yu-Gi-Oh! As we entered 2003, with another core set around the corner to potentially disprove that point.